Hello YouTube! Today we're going to look at relativism. Now there are many different kinds of relativism, some of which are fairly common. For instance, moral relativism, which claims that the truth of moral judgments is relative to the individual or the culture. Or relativism about motion. Every sensible person these days accepts that motion is relative to one's frame of reference. Motion is always judged from a particular frame of reference, and there is no privileged frame of reference, no one correct frame of reference from which we can determine the real motion or absolute motion of an object. How fast is the Earth moving through space? Well, from the Sun's frame of reference, it's about 67,000 miles an hour. From the frame of reference of the galactic center, it's about 490,000 miles an hour. And like that's it. There is no fact about what its absolute motion, its real motion is, independently of these reference frames. So this is relativism. This is a localized relativism, a relativism about motion specifically. In this video and the next, we're going to focus on some rather more radical forms of relativism. So there is relativism about truth, or alethic relativism, which claims that the truth value of any statement is relative to a particular perspective. There's no perspective that is objectively privileged. Relativism about justification, or epistemic relativism, claims that there are different systems of epistemic justification. Whether or not a belief is justified is relative to one's perspective, and no perspective is objectively privileged over others. So when we talk about relativism from this point forward, it will be these forms of relativism that we have in mind. Basically, relativism about knowledge. There is no objective absolute fact about whether a given belief is true or justified. Instead, this will be relative to some perspective. So let's try to define this a little more precisely. In her article, Scientific Perspectives, Feminist Standpoints and Non-Silly Relativism, Natalie Ashton identifies three core components of relativism. Dependence, which says that the truth value of any belief is dependent on a particular perspective. Like a belief has a truth value only relative to a given perspective. It doesn't. You might not want to say perspective. You might want to say like standpoint, or theory, or whatever. But we'll use the term perspective as just a general kind of catch-all term. So we can only assign a truth value to a belief from a given perspective. Second, plurality, which claims that there are many perspectives, which will assign different truth values to beliefs. And third, non-neutral symmetry, which claims that there is no perspective-independent way to judge different perspectives. So no perspective is objectively privileged over others. There is no neutral way to show that a given perspective is privileged above others. Basically, whenever you judge a perspective, you do so from within a given perspective. You can't, step outside all of the perspectives and see which one is like absolutely the right one. Now I frame this in terms of truth value. For the epistemic relativist, just alter the dependence claim. So dependence for epistemic relativism will say that a belief has an epistemic status as justified or unjustified only relative to a given perspective, like some set of epistemic standards or some epistemic system or something like that. So that's relativism. Relativism is contrasted with absolutism. Absolutism is the view that the standards for truth or justification hold universally. There is an objective fact of the matter whether a given belief is true or false, justified or unjustified. So, a couple of points about this statement of relativism. First of all, this is incomplete. So the obvious question is, well, what exactly is a perspective? How are we defining this? What exactly is truth or justification supposed to be relative to? Well, different answers to this question will generate different forms of relativism. We might say that truth is relative to the perspective of the individual, or maybe it's relative to the perspective of the culture, a collection of individuals, or perhaps it's relative to some sort of more specific historical tradition, say a particular scientific tradition or a conceptual scheme or something like that. A relativist influenced by Thomas Kuhn might say that truth is relative to a scientific paradigm. Obviously, there are many options available here. We will not look at all of these alternatives in this particular video, just because what's controversial about relativism are really these three core claims. There is a substantial and often heated debate between relativists and absolutists. Many philosophers question whether any kind of relativism could be coherent. The debate among relativists about exactly what kind of relativism is right has had less impact, so that's something we'll come on to later. A second point to bear in mind about relativism, which is often lost in the debates around relativism, is it's very important to distinguish the thesis of non-neutral symmetry from the thesis that we might call equal validity. So according to equal validity, all perspectives are equally correct. We can't rank one perspective as being superior to any other. Now, non-neutral symmetry and equal validity are very different claims. They're not just different, they're incompatible. Non-neutral symmetry doesn't entail that rankings of perspectives are impossible. It only says that you can't have perspective-independent rankings. So any ranking of perspectives will itself be made from some perspective. Equal validity, by contrast, is a ranking. It ranks all perspectives equally. And it seems to assume a neutral standpoint from which the rankings are made. In this respect, equal validity, like if you're saying that equal validity is just like the correct position, the absolutely correct position, then it would in fact be a rather odd form of absolutism, not a form of relativism. So relativists are not committed to equal validity. They're not committed to the claim that all perspectives or all epistemic standards or whatever are of equal status. And this point, as I say, I think this is important, and it's something that a lot of people seem to miss. But it's important not to conflate relativism with equal validity. Equal validity is silly. Relativism is not so silly. Okay, so in this video we're going to look at three classic objections to relativism. So it might seem a little bit odd to structure a series on relativism in this way, right? Like I'm starting with the objections to relativism rather than the arguments for it. The reason for this is simply that at least in Western philosophy, in Western analytic philosophy, well, not just analytic, but like, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, relativism has long been held to be an absurd position. Like, if any position is found to entail relativism, this is seen as a reductio of that position. Relativism is very widely rejected, and often this rejection is on the basis of one of these classic arguments. These arguments are old, versions of them go back thousands of years. Any form of relativism needs to contend with them, and if there's any hope of getting a relativist position accepted, it's probably going to have to begin by responding to these arguments. So I'm going to present this in terms of relativism about truth, but it should be fairly obvious how everything I say here can be translated for relativism about justification. But just so I don't have to keep repeating this for two very similar positions, I'm just going to present this in terms of relativism about truth. Okay, first of all then, the claim that relativism is either self-refuting or self-undermining. So I guess the standard way to state the problem is this. If relativism is true, then all truths are relative to perspectives, right? There are no absolute truths. So relativism is true, itself is true relative to some perspectives, not to others. The relativist then has no argument against the absolutist. Indeed, she grants that absolutism is true in just the same sense that relativism is. But then if absolutism is true, relativism is false. So it appears that relativism is self-refuting. We can state this problem perhaps more precisely in the form of a dilemma. So either relativism itself is absolutely true, or it is only relatively true. So, like, either it's true absolutely, or it's true only relative to some perspectives. Now, if relativism is absolutely true, then there is an absolute truth, which relativism denies. So in that case, relativism is self-refuting. If it's only relatively true, well, we have two difficulties. First, it's going to be false for non-relativists. But since truth is relative to perspective, it follows that relativism is false. Indeed, it follows that it's absolutely false, because absolutists are going to say that relativism is absolutely false. So again, we have this issue of self-refutation. And a second issue here is that it seems that the relativist no longer has an argument against the absolutist. The relativist has conceded that the absolutist is correct from the absolutist's own perspective. So the relativist has given the absolutist no reason to abandon her position. And this is self-undermining. So that's the one way to present this kind of problem. Now there are two, I guess, look, there are two horns of a dilemma here, right? Like, option one is to really embrace the idea that relativism is absolutely true, in which case you would want to exempt relativism from its own scope in order to avoid the self-refutation. Option two is to really go all the way on relativism and say that relativism is only relatively true. That relativism, there just is no perspective-independent way to establish relativism. But okay, let's look at option one, and this is the view that all truths are relative except the truth of the claim that all truths are relative. So you exempt relativism from its own scope. All truths are relative except the truth of relativism itself. Now, this does avoid the problem of self-refutation. If you explicitly exempt relativism from its own scope, then, okay, it's just an absolute truth that all truths except the truth of relativism are relative. Equally obviously, this isn't really a form of relativism, it's a form of absolutism. So unsurprisingly, this is not an option that relativists have tended to go for. On the other hand, though, if we could show that this is correct, it would be a fairly significant conclusion. It's close enough to relativism that the majority of absolutists would be disturbed by it, and I suppose the majority of relativists would probably consider it to capture much of what's important about their position. On this kind of view, it's still going to be the case that, for example, all scientific hypotheses are true only relative to a given perspective, and there is no privileged scientific perspective. That would be a controversial claim. So let's call this position almost relativism. Well, there isn't much literature on almost relativism. However, I take it that one obvious problem for this position is that it's not clear how you could actually go about arguing for it. Any argument for almost relativism will need to appeal to premises, perhaps features of the world or features of our knowledge-generating practices or whatever. For such an argument to establish an absolutist truth, then these other premises will themselves need to be absolutely true. So, at the very least, if the almost relativist uses premises that are true only relative to some perspective, then the traditional absolutist will object that this fails to provide any challenge to her position, since the traditional absolutist is only interested in premises that are true, period, and not premises that are true relative to some perspective. So in order to argue effectively for almost relativism, we will need to exempt much more than just the thesis of relativism itself from the scope of relativism. But obviously, the more we exempt, the more mundane the position becomes. I should also say, another thing that's odd about almost relativism is that it supposes that a particular piece of philosophical knowledge is uniquely privileged, right? Like, epistemologists can come to know the truth of almost relativism, plus, I guess, whatever philosophical premises are required to support almost relativism. Everybody else is condemned to discover only relative truths. But, like, why on earth would epistemologists have such a special capacity? Why would they be in such a unique position? There are many other fields like physics and biology that seem to generate results of far more reliability and practical utility than is found in epistemology. So there's something rather strange about saying, well, the epistemologists, they can get to the absolute truth of almost relativism, but everybody else is stuck with only relative truths. So look, as I mentioned, very few people have defended almost relativism, but I just present it here as a possible position that somebody might take. So let's turn to option 2, which is that relativism is only relatively true. And this is, of course, just relativism, right? This is genuine relativism. The genuine relativist will grant that relativism is false from certain perspectives, and there is no perspective-independent way to judge that these perspectives are inferior. Is this self-refuting? The problem here is that the relativist is granting that absolutism is true from the absolutist's perspective. So we seem to have the claim that relativism is true and that and that relativism is false, which is just plainly contradictory. Well, this is a bit too quick, right? The relativist will say, look, this kind of thing is only a problem if you're assuming an absolutist account of truth, right? So your relativists don't even want to claim that relativism is absolutely true, or relativism is true across all perspectives, or anything like that. They want to claim that relativism is true relative to their perspective. The relativist does not assert the contradiction that relativism is true and relativism is false. She simply asserts that relativism is true. And she will say that this truth, like all truths, is relative to her perspective. She can acknowledge the existence of other perspectives, perhaps according to which, on these perspectives, relativism is false, without asserting the content of those perspectives. So, in this way, relativism is not self-refuting. It does not assert an outright contradiction. But perhaps the relativist is still in trouble here. There are two problems with this kind of response, which are noted by Andrei Kukla in his book Social Constructivism and the Philosophy of Science. So first objection to this is some people have argued that genuine relativism remains self-refuting because the very concept of relative truth is parasitic on the concept of absolute truth. So that is, we can't even understand what relative truth is unless we understand absolute truth. Or maybe the idea is that absolute truth is in some sense like conceptually prior to relative truth. Like when we consider a relativistic claim that we all endorse, like the claim that motion is relative to one's reference frame. So I say the Earth is moving at 67,000 miles per hour. That's true relative to the reference frame of the solar system. What allows us to make sense of this is that we take the relativity statement as itself absolutely true, right? The Earth is moving at 67,000 miles per hour relative to the reference frame of the solar system. That's simply true. That's the way the world is. There's no more to it. Anyway, the thought is we can't claim that something is relatively true without also claiming that something is absolutely true. Namely, the relative truth claim is itself absolutely true. So when the relativist says that all truths are relative without exception, she does involve herself in a self-refutation, because in asserting that there are relative truths, she commits herself to some absolute truths. Now, there is a fairly serious problem with this argument, pointed out by Kukla. Let's suppose it's true that the concept of relative truth is parasitic on the concept of absolute truth. Well, in that case, you can't have the concept of relative truth unless you already grasp the concept of absolute truth. But it simply doesn't follow from this that the claims made using the relativized notion of truth will logically entail that there are absolute truths. So, in fact, just in general, it may be the case that in order to understand or explicate some concept X, you need to use some other concept Y. It may be that, like, X somehow conceptually depends on the concept Y. Maybe because X is by definition a non-Y, for instance. But the existence of X's will not commit you to the existence of Y's. That's just that's a different claim. So this objection to the relativist is not so convincing. However, the other concern about taking the second option is, if the relativist says that relativism is true only relative to their perspective, well, the relativist simply fails to address the absolutist. And this is the concern about relativism being self-undermining. The relativist is saying, from my perspective, relativism is true. From your perspective, absolutism is true. Neither perspective is privileged. She grants that from the absolutist's perspective, absolutism is true. So she's given the absolutist no reason to give up the absolutist position. Indeed, the absolutist doesn't really even need to deny what the relativist is claiming here. It's just like if somebody were to say that from within the fiction of Sherlock Holmes, it's true that Sherlock Holmes lives on 221B Baker Street. Few people would deny this. What we would add is that the fiction of Sherlock Holmes is false. It's fiction, right? So, we'd say, okay, yeah, from within that fiction, it's true that he lives on 221B Baker Street, but it's fiction, it's false. Yeah. So he doesn't actually live on 221B Baker Street. Similarly, the absolutist can grant that from the relativist's perspective, relativism is true. Right? Like, yeah, if you adopt the relativist perspective, relativism is true. It's just that, in fact, the relativist perspective is false, absolutely false. And of course, now the relativist will just accept all of this, right? The relativist will grant that this is all true from the absolutist's perspective. So it seems that not only does the relativist have no case against the absolutist, she doesn't even deny the content of the absolutist's position. So, is this a problem? Does this make relativism self-undermining? Well, I think there are several responses available here. First, the relativist might hold that the inability to deny an opponent's position is not necessarily self-undermining. There's nothing necessarily self-undermining about that. And I think the best example to explain why is a view known as trivialism. Trivialism is the position that all propositions are true. It follows, of course, that the trivialist also holds that no propositions are true, because she assigns true to the proposition no propositions are true. She also believes that only some propositions are true, because she assigns true to the proposition some propositions are true. And she believes that there are in fact no propositions and that there is no truth. And she believes that all people are scrambled eggs. Every proposition is true. She just assigns true to everything. Trivialism is a bizarre position. It's incoherent. It's impossible to believe it, and yet some philosophers have defended it. Paul Douglas Cabet has defended trivialism and has argued that there have been defences of trivialism historically. Anyway, the reason why I bring this up is in the same way that it's not possible for the relativist to deny absolutism, it's also not possible for anybody to deny trivialism. So the trivialist claims that all propositions are true, so she will agree with everything you say. It isn't possible to argue with the trivialist. Anytime you attempt to make an argument against trivialism, you're simply asserting part of the content of trivialism. So if you say trivialism is false, well, the trivialist agrees that trivialism is false. Trivialism is false. That proposition is part of the content of trivialism. It's not a denial of trivialism. All you've done is just assert part of her position. You cannot assert an alternative to trivialism. Nevertheless, you probably don't believe trivialism, and you probably don't take this to be a particularly convincing argument for trivialism. So in the same way, the relativist might say, well, yeah, there's a sense in which relativists can't deny the content of absolutism, but that's not really a conclusive argument. That doesn't mean that absolutism is a reasonable position to hold. Another response to the idea that relativists can't deny or assert an alternative to absolutism comes from Robert Nozick in his book Invariances. He turns this kind of argument around against the absolutist. Nozick says that from the relativist's point of view, the absolutist will be the one who has trouble asserting their position, because absolutism is, as he puts it, encircled and enfolded by relativism, but not vice versa. So here's how this works. The absolutist will say, there is an absolute truth, or there are some absolute truths, or whatever. But certainly the absolutist will say that, yes, there is an absolute truth. Now the relativist looks at this and responds, okay, A, right, the claim that there is an absolute truth, A is true for you, but not for me. So the absolutist hasn't yet said anything that will trouble the relativist. So the absolutist strengthens her claim as follows. She says, there is an absolute truth, and it's true for everyone. To which the relativist responds, okay, that's true for you, but not for me. And now what's the absolutist to say? Well, maybe the absolutist will say, it is an absolute truth, which is true for everyone. That there is an absolute truth, which is true for everyone. But again, the relativist can just say, that's true for you, but not for me. The relativist keeps capturing absolutism within her own position. Now, Nozick imagines the absolutist objecting, okay, look, I'm not going to allow the relativist to just keep going up a level. Instead, I'm going to make a claim that covers an infinite number of levels. So I'm going to say S1, I'm going to make the claim S1, and the claim S1 is there is an absolute truth, and S2, that S1 is absolutely true, and S3, that S2 is absolutely true, and so on infinitely. But of course, that doesn't work, because the relativist can just quote all of this, including those little dots of infinite continuation. The relativist can quote all of this and say, well, that's true for you, but not for me. So anything that the absolutist says can be encircled and enfolded by the relativist. By contrast, the relativist says all truths are relative. Call this claim R. Well, how does the absolutist respond to this? The absolutist says R is false, absolutely false. Just a straight denial. And in response to this, the relativist will again say, well, F is true for you, but not for me. And the previous game starts again. Now notice the asymmetry here. The absolutist's statements are enfolded by the relativist. The absolutist is unable to state her opposing position. However, while the relativist's claim that all truths are relative can be denied by the absolutist, it doesn't get enfolded. So, according to Nozick then, from the relativist's point of view, the absolutist fails to deny the content of relativism. The absolutist fails to state her position in a way that contradicts the relativist, because the absolutist's claim is enfolded by the relativist. On the other hand, from the absolutist's point of view, the relativist has denied the content of absolutism. That's why the absolutist will respond by just saying, no, right? The claim that all truths are relative, that's false. That's just absolutely false. So, I mean, look, this can get kind of confusing, right? I mean, with all of this said, it sort of feels like we're in a bit of a stalemate here. The initial claim of the objection to relativism, the objection that relativism is self-undermining, is that relativists can't deny the content of absolutism, but it looks like there are plausible reasons to think that absolutists can't deny the content of relativism. Maybe this is a stalemate. There is, however, another point in response to the self-undermining argument, which perhaps has more chance of succeeding or of convincing the opponent. So it's simply this. Relativists actually can challenge absolutists and can deny their position because perhaps relativism is true according to some perspective that all interlocutors accept. And this is, in fact, how most arguments for relativism actually proceed, right? The relativist will cite premises that she hopes either everybody already accepts or that can themselves be defended from further premises that everybody accepts. Suppose it could be shown, for example, that the existence of chairs entailed relativism. That's obviously not very likely, but let's just imagine that this is the case. If this were established conclusively, if it were established that the existence of chairs entailed relativism, well, absolutists would be in a tricky position because almost all absolutists accept the existence of chairs. So even if the relativist accepts, so the relativist says relativism is true only relative to some perspectives, but even with that said, she can still forward arguments against the absolutist. She just needs to look for premises that both relativists and absolutists accept. There's a closely related point here which is often overlooked, and which I think underlies a lot of the resistance to relativism. Many people seem to suppose that relativism entails that you can believe whatever you want to believe, basically. So they think that relativists endorse a principle along these lines. P is true from your perspective, just in case you believe that P. Now, no sensible relativist endorses this position. Relativists only hold what we called dependence, plurality, and non-neutral symmetry. So truth value is dependent on perspective, there are many perspectives, and there is no perspective-independent way to judge different perspectives. Now, all of this is compatible with denying belief. It could be the case that, from your perspective, some of your beliefs are false. So the mere fact that somebody believes absolutism doesn't entail that absolutism is true from her perspective. That's going to depend on the details of what her perspective is. Another principle that relativists need not accept is this one, what I'm calling plenitude, which is the principle that for every proposition there is some perspective from which that proposition is true. Again, dependence, plurality, non-neutral symmetry, they don't entail this. So in principle, I think the relativist could hold that there is actually no perspective from which absolutism is true. I think this would be a tricky argument to make because, it looks like we can imagine logically possible perspectives that would kind of force the truth of absolutism. I guess we could maybe imagine somebody who takes absolutism as a basic fundamental assumption in the context of a foundationalist model of epistemology or something like that. I don't know. But, just in principle, you might actually just argue that, that there just is no perspective from which absolutism is true. Anyway, at the very least, holding that relativism is only relatively true does not prevent the relativist from challenging the absolutist or from denying the absolutist's position. That was one of the classic arguments against relativism. Let's turn to the second argument against relativism, the infinite regress argument. Okay, the relativist says that relativism is true, but she will not claim that relativism is absolutely true. Rather, relativism is true only relative to some perspective. But what about this claim, that relativism is true only relative to some perspective? Well, again, the relativist doesn't simply assert this. Rather, this itself is true only relative to some perspective. And of course, this goes on indefinitely. So we have a situation like this. Proposition A, all truths are relative. Then A is true relative to perspective P. Then A1, that previous proposition, is true relative to perspective P star. And then again, that proposition is true relative to perspective P star star, and so on. And we get an infinite series. And notice that we can generate this series from any claim whatsoever, right? Like whatever we substitute for proposition A will allow us to start the regress. Now, this raises a couple of problems. first problem, kind of a minor issue this, but it's worth noting. So the first problem is you might say, well, how could there be an infinite sequence of perspectives? I mean, just like how could infinite perspectives exist? Now, of course, maybe truth isn't relativized to perspective, maybe it's relativized to something else, maybe it's relative to standpoint or theory or system or conceptual scheme or whatever. But however we fill in the details, we're going to need an infinite series, and it doesn't seem like there could be an infinite series of any of these things. Perspectives, standpoints, theories, systems, these are all the products of the actions of people, and people can't do an infinite number of things. So that's one worry about this, that we seem to have just this infinite sequence of things where you couldn't have infinities. Now, on this point, I think that there are some plausible responses available to the relativist. So, in the first place, we can argue that actually it is possible to construct infinities. Possible example here is mathematics, at least if we adopt an anti-Platonist account of mathematics. The second, and more importantly, we don't actually need an infinite number of perspectives. So what I've called perspectives P, P star, and P star star, and so on, all the perspectives in that infinite series might be the same perspective, right? So P and P star and P star star and so on might just be identical. Nothing in this infinite series requires that we are using a different perspective each time. So it seems like that concern about how could there be an infinite sequence of perspectives can be adequately dealt with. There's a second and more serious problem here, which is that it actually isn't obvious what this infinite sequence means, right? Like, it's not clear that we can actually grasp what is being stated by this claim. So the main concern that's raised by the regress problem is that relativism can't actually be expressed. We cannot state any proposition that captures what the relativist wants to say. So, like in ordinary discourse, we assert some claim X, and that's that, right? We just make a claim. The sky is blue, okay, and that's that. Now, the relativist will not simply assert her claim, right? She won't simply assert all truths are relative. That doesn't express her actual opinion. She will need to go up to a higher level and say, well, all truths are relative. That itself is true relative to some perspective, right? But in saying this, she has again failed to express her actual opinion, because the claim all truths are relative is true relative to some perspective. That itself is true only relative to some perspective. And so, here's the regress. Nothing the relativist says expresses her view. And even if we accept infinitely iterated sentences, the relativist is still in trouble. Let's say we allow the relativist to make like an infinite chain of relativized truth claims. Again, really not clear what that even means, but let's just assume we can do that and label it IA. Well, the relativist is now in the same position as before, because she won't simply assert IA. She, again, will hold that IA is true relative to some perspective, right? And, we're off again. We're off on the regress. So anything the relativist says seems too strong. Anything she says seems to be too much, and so fails to express her position. She can never, add enough of the relative to some perspective qualifications. Okay, so how might the relativist respond to this? Well, one way that she might deal with this is to say that traditional absolutism faces the same problem. So consider the proposition X, that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. Well, we can get a regress from this, right? Because we will say that X is a truth. So we'll say X1, X is a truth. And then X2, X1 is a truth. And so on, indefinitely. So there's nothing special about relativism, would be the claim. These kinds of regresses can be generated in many contexts. It's just that's just the way that truth works, right? Like, if you have a true proposition, so if X is a true proposition, then it will also be a true proposition that X is a true proposition. And then that will be a true proposition, and so on, indefinitely. However, there is an important difference between these two infinite regresses. Or between these two infinite chains. So what makes X true is that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. And what makes X1 true is the truth of X. And what makes X2 true is the truth of X1, which, as I said, is itself made true by X, which is made true by the fact that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. So these statements are all made true by the same fact. There's a particular base fact, as it were, from which the infinity of true statements follows. Understanding the base fact doesn't require understanding these true statements. By contrast, in the case of relativism, well, the original claim is that all truths are relative, but that base claim is not what the relativist wants to say. She needs it to be relativized to some perspective. Like understanding that claim, right? Understanding the relativist's claim that all truths are relative does require understanding the infinite sequence, the infinite chain of relative truth statements. So the problem for relativism is that this infinite chain, this infinite regress, blocks us from expressing or understanding the relativist position. But perhaps we chose a bad analogy here. A different version of this same response is suggested by David Bloor in his article Epistemic Grace. For Bloor, an infinite sequence of perspectives to which truth is relative is essentially no different from how causal claims can be traced back indefinitely. We often explain an event by pointing to a prior cause of the event, but now we need another cause to explain that cause, and then we need another cause to explain that cause, like that. So, causal claim, first causal claim will be E was caused by E star, but then E star was caused by E star star, and so on and so on. Nobody thinks that this is a problem, that this threatens the coherence of causal explanation. So, why would it be a problem that for any given claim there is a further perspective from which that claim is true? As Bloor says, and I quote, "We can take the sequence as far as we want and then stop when our curiosity is satisfied. That is, when we reach something we can take for granted." So Bloor's position is that, look, the infinite regress of perspectives means that there's always more work to do if we are inclined to do it, right? And when we take the relativist's infinite sequence of perspectives, Bloor's idea seems to be that we could, if we wanted to, try to uncover the perspective from which A3 is true, but we don't need to. Just as we don't need to follow causal chains back indefinitely, right? Like you can just stop, right, at basically any point. Perhaps once we have reached A3, or maybe even earlier in the chain, there's just going to be little interest in following the chain back further. Indeed, we can probably stop right at the start. After all, the original claim A already covers all the truths, so it's obviously self-referential. We probably actually want to know the perspective from which something like A is true, but then once you've got that, you can, there's probably no need to continue investigating further. So Bloor seems to suggest anyway. Again, I think this kind of misses the point of the regress objection. So in the case of causal explanation, there's nothing mysterious about a causal chain extending back indefinitely. Causal chains are, standardly conceived as objective features of the world, not dependent on our activities. Again, they're standardly conceived as objective features of the world. I'm well aware of the challenges to objectivist views of causation, but I'm just going to ignore that for these purposes. So anyway, look, causal chains maybe terminate with the beginning of the universe or with other uncaused events, or maybe they just extend back forever. Where does causal explanation end? Well, yeah, wherever we want it to, right? To explain an event E by saying it was caused by some other event E star, that does raise the question of what caused E star. But yeah, we can choose whether or not to pursue it. We may well hold that C1, C, C1 and C2 together constitute a better explanation of E than C alone, because we've cited more of the causal chain leading to E. But the important point here is that, so when we discover the facts described in C1, that doesn't affect the causal relation described in C, right? So we might learn that C1 is false while still having perfectly good reason to believe C. We can be wrong about an earlier part of the causal chain while getting the later part of the causal chain exactly right. On the other hand, the falsity of A1 clearly bears on the truth of A, right? Like if A1 is false, A is in trouble. So that's like that's why we need to have the whole chain in the case of the relativist. Like we don't need the whole causal chain, because claim C can be true, right? That can be true no matter what we don't need to know the truth of anything else to know that C is true. And if we do go back further and make claims C1 and C2, we might discover that they're wrong and still assert claim C. On the other hand, in the case of the relativist's infinite sequence, we need these other claims to be true in order for that first claim A to be true. I mean, we can say that we have a better explanation the more causes we cite, like the further down the causal chain we go. But we wouldn't say that a claim is like more true the further we go along the sequence of perspectives. Like it would be bizarre to claim that A is initially somewhat true and then becomes more true as we learn the truth of A1 and A2 and so on. I mean, and that's certainly not what the relativist is trying to claim anyway. So there seem to be some important disanalogies between the causal case and the relativist's case. So a second response to the regress problem is that it depends on a mischaracterization of relativism. The assumption is that when the relativist asserts a proposition X, this has to be understood as abbreviating the claim that X is true relative to P. So when the relativist says X, we have to take that as abbreviating X is true relative to P. But relativism need not be understood this way. Right, like the relativist will indeed claim that X is true relative to P, but this doesn't entail that when she expresses X, she is expressing that X is true relative to P. So X and X is true relative to P are different claims, and they can be different claims even coming from the mouth of a relativist. When the relativist asserts X, she's just expressing X. She's not abbreviating the claim that X is true relative to P. So the idea is that no regress needs to be generated. The relativist's position is captured entirely in claim A, in the claim that all truths are relative. The relativist will also endorse A1, the claim that A itself is true relative to some perspective P, but A already captures her position perfectly adequately. So the relativist has no trouble asserting her position. Her position is captured in claim A. That's all. Now this point is maybe a bit subtle, so it might be worth considering a less contentious proposition. So let's take the sky is blue. The critic of relativism is assuming that the relativist cannot simply assert the sky is blue. And this is because, from the relativist's point of view, this can be true only relative to a perspective. So the critic is assuming that the relativist must be asserting something like, the sky is blue is true relative to perspective P. But the relativist just doesn't need to accept this move. So yes, the relativist will admit that the sky is blue is itself true only relative to some perspective. But this need not be part of the content of what she's saying. She can just say, the sky is blue. She takes it that this is true. Now, she perhaps has a controversial analysis of what truth is and how truth works, but that doesn't need to be part of the content of the claim, the sky is blue. Her analysis of truth is a separate claim. So look, in the same way, right, when the absolutist says the sky is blue, we don't assume that this is abbreviating the sky is blue is true absolutely. And so this is perhaps a better way to make an analogy with absolutism. The absolutist is making the assumption that when the relativist makes any claim, such as the sky is blue, she needs to add the qualification that it is true only relative to some perspective. Otherwise, she has failed to express her actual state of opinion. She needs to add that qualification in order to avoid affirming anything absolutely. But surely you would only accept this if you already assume an absolutist account of truth, right? You'd only accept that you need to add that qualification if you assume an absolutist account of truth. And I mean, look, the relativist, so maybe the best way to see this is the relativist can make the same argument against the absolutist. So the absolutist says the sky is blue. Now, the relativist will object that the absolutist has failed to express her actual state of opinion, because so far she's only affirmed that the sky is blue is relatively true, right? Like if the absolutist just says the sky is blue, the relativist can say, well, you know, that you've not really expressed your actual state of opinion, because all you've done is affirm that it's relatively true. So the absolutist needs to add the qualification that the sky is blue is true absolutely. And this will, of course, generate a regress for the absolutist, because she will need to say, for every sentence, that it is true absolutely. For every sentence X that she states, she will need the higher level sentence, X is absolutely true. So basically, the response here is, the regress objection depends on the implicit assumption that whenever we make any claim, we are implicitly committed to an absolutist conception of truth. And so when the relativist says all truths are relative, well, that fails to express her actual opinion, because this implicitly asserts that it's an absolute truth that all truths are relative. But obviously, the relativist is going to reject this assumption. That's the second argument. Let's turn to the final argument, the third classic argument against relativism. And this is the claim that relativism is dangerous. So this is more of a moral or pragmatic objection. The absolutist charges that relativism is anti-rational, anti-intellectual, anti-scientific. If it were accepted, it would have the effect of eroding critical thinking, eroding rationality, and eroding science, and so on. Many people suppose that for relativists there is no difference between, being right and merely thinking that you're right. All theories are on a par, even the sloppiest and most ridiculous. Modern science is just one way of seeing the world among many. So the relativist is powerless to offer a convincing response to anti-vaccination movements, flat earthers, climate change denialists, and so on. All the relativist can say is, well, from my perspective, vaccines are very helpful. But from Frank's perspective, vaccines are harmful. And my perspective is no better than Frank's. No doubt this kind of worry is why the debates about relativism sometimes become so acrimonious. Relativism is not simply wrong, it's dangerous. Now, the first response to this is simple. The fact that a given position is dangerous is irrelevant to whether or not it's true. We are inquiring about whether or not relativism is true. It is a non sequitur to try to answer this question by examining the political consequences that relativism might have. So this argument just misses the point. But second, we can turn this argument around, because to argue against a belief on the grounds that it is dangerous is itself a dangerous method of belief evaluation. Throughout history, almost every idea that raised a significant challenge to the status quo has been rejected by some people on the grounds that it's dangerous. Many ideas that played a role in improving human society were claimed to be dangerous. Heliocentrism, evolution by natural selection, atheism, equal rights for men and women, equal rights for all races, these were once seen as dangerous ideas. So the historical record of the appeal to dangerous consequences is itself not particularly encouraging. Now, having said all of this, I think we should take this concern seriously, right? Like, is relativism a dangerous idea? Will it lead to the erosion of science and rationality? Well, I have to say, I think this has been massively overstated. Recall the point made earlier, that relativists need not be committed to the claim that what is true for you is simply a matter of what you believe is true, right? I don't know, I guess it's logically possible for somebody to adopt epistemic standards on which, like, P is true just means I believe that P, or at least like that's enough for the truth of P. But that would be really bizarre. Most people don't accept an epistemic system, anything like this. Indeed, most people arguably can't, right? You can't just believe what you want. Let's take a simple example. Could I just make it true that I am a millionaire, like just by believing it? I mean, of course I could work to earn £1 million, but could I make it true that right now I'm a millionaire just by believing it? Well, no, right? And given my general epistemic standards and my other beliefs, if I did come to believe right now that I were a millionaire, it would be easy to show that I'm wrong by the epistemic standards that I myself adopt. And no doubt there are many beliefs I have right now that you can show are wrong by my own standards, from my own epistemic perspective. I mean, that's what happens, right? Like, that's why people's beliefs change. So we evaluate beliefs on the basis of things like coherence and predictive power and explanatory power and simplicity and so on. Of course, there's debate about exactly which of these we should take as appropriate foundations for forming beliefs, but all of them strongly constrain what will be true from a given perspective. And notice, furthermore, that these are the standards that we will appeal to, regardless of whether we are relativists or absolutists. Relativists will judge claims to be true or false, to be justified or unjustified, in much the same way that absolutists will. And in practice, a relativist can make exactly the same arguments against an anti-vaxxer or a climate change denialist as an absolutist can. The relativist will appeal to basically the same sources of evidence and the same standards of belief formation. So the pernicious consequences, the dangers of relativism do seem to be a little bit overstated. That's all for today. We will look at some different forms of relativism and some of the arguments in favour of relativism in later videos. But what I wanted to do today was just get some of these standard objections out of the way right from the start. And I mean, look, that's not to say that there is a convincing response to these objections. Many philosophers consider one or more of these classic arguments to be convincing against the relativist. I just wanted to go through those and show you how relativists might respond. That's all. Goodbye.